Welcome everybody to our webinar on memoir writing. We have as our guest our very dear associate, Joanne Hichens, the other Joanne, as we refer to her, who does a lot of work with us. So I'm not going to talk for very long. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Jo, and then I'm going to hand over to her. She's going to talk to you briefly, and then she's going to answer the questions that were sent in. So, Jo, she lives in Cape Town, but she's joining us from Greece at the moment. She has edited numerous anthologies of short stories, one of which won the National Institute for Humanities and Social Sciences Award for the Best Edited Collection. Most recently, she and Karina Shurek compiled and edited another book of stories, Hair, weaving and unpicking stories of identity. She's penned three crime novels, one of them co-written. Those are Out to Score, Divine Justice, and Sweet Paradise. And her young adult novels, a couple of those, were each shortlisted for the Sanlam Literature Award. And her memoir, which has sold very well and done exceptionally well on the market, called Death and the After Parties. That's her latest literary offering, and she's busy with another memoir at the moment. So, welcome. And so, Jo, we thought we would ask you to start by just telling us a little bit about your experience of writing memoir and publishing.
Sure. Thanks so much, Josie, for inviting me to do this memoir webinar. And also, I just love working with All About Writing. You're a generous-spirited bunch of mentors and writers, and it's always a thrill to work with you. So thank you. You know, as you were reading my biography or sharing with the group, I just thought, the one thing I don't do is stay in my lane. I always wanted to be a crime fiction writer. I tried that. I've written youth novels. I've even had a poem published. So I've kind of done all sorts of things. But I really have learned that I enjoy writing memoir. So this is what I seem to be teaching most these days. And that kind of came about as a surprise to me. I had written opinion pieces for newspapers and personal pieces, which I think one could consider sort of a memoir, those op-ed pieces. But after my husband died, I kept up a writing journal, and that ultimately became the memoir Death and the After Parties. So interestingly, Paul Mason sent through some questions about my memoir. So we thought we would actually just start with those. The first thing he wanted to know is, how did I arrive at the narrative strategies that best suited my writerly purpose for Death and the After Parties? And I must say, I had no particular writerly strategies. I really just started writing. I kept at it. I kept writing my thoughts for my diary. I never really thought of the literary merit of it. I was merely keeping a kind of a death journal, which helped me therapeutically to not get over my husband's death, but certainly to deal with the practicalities of it. And it was probably only a year after I started this process and after he had died and we'd scattered his ashes that I decided that it might come together as a memoir. And as a writer, that is what our lives actually become ultimately, is material. So, you know, I hope it doesn't sound callous to say that, but I was working through my own life by writing about my life. Paul asks, what kinds of writerly sufferings and joys or setbacks and breakthroughs accompanied me, on the memoir writing journey? So I would say the greatest suffering was really reliving everything. I finally got to the stage when I thought, if I have to rewrite my husband's death scene one more time, I'm going to run down the street and beg to be tranquilized and put in a loony bin. Yeah, it was such an intense scene. And writing it in my journal the first time was very different to then having to go back to that scene and rewriting it, and then looking at it with an editor's eye, making sure the detail was right, making sure it was interesting enough for the book, making sure it was a seminal scene. So that for me was one of the difficult things. And I think it's something we all face as writers, in particular in memoir. We're writing about memory, we're writing about our lives. Sometimes we just want to move on, but we've made a commitment to writing a memoir, and thus that pertains for all works that we write, and so we keep going. The joys, I think for me, writing the story, learning about death and dying, coming to accept it, coming to accept that it's going to happen to me too, so facing my own mortality, and ultimately working on the craft, creating a good story with themes and a narrative arc. I love that aspect of the writing. When you've put down the first draft, when you've rewritten it several times, 2, 3, maybe 4 drafts, and then you get to focus on the craft of it, knowing that it's coming together as a book. Paul asks, how long did it take me to write the memoir? From inception, first seedling, to completion, fully fledged tree. I literally started writing the week after my husband died in 2014. But I'd already written part of my mother's death previously. And what was interesting for me was the more I wrote about my husband's death, the more I realized that the way I handled loss went back to my childhood. And so I started also then to write about my childhood, because it really influenced the way I was dealing with this really most awful and personal loss in my life. So that for me was interesting. And I do admit as well to being a little bit of a pantser. And I'm sure many of you know that those two terms. You're either a pantser or a plotter. Most of us are somewhere in between. Some people like to plot out their memoir, their fiction work, whatever they're writing, to the last detail. I tend to allow it to flow more organically. But at some stage, one does want to have some kind of a scheme, some kind of a plot, some kind of idea of how the story is going to come together, what that structure is going to look like, and what it's going to look like as a finished product. It was published in 2020 during COVID. So that's more or less a total of 6 years or more of regular writing. So that's what you're in for, writing a memoir. Some of us write more immediately and faster. Other people take their time. So it really depends on how regularly you write, how committed you are, how passionate you are. Okay, so now we're going to start off with the questions, and I'm going to start off with Nomvula Dlamini, who sent in a couple of questions. The first is, what is the difference between a memoir and a biography? A biography is the story of a person's life and achievements as told from the perspective of another writer, another person. An autobiography is the story of life as told by the writer themselves, and generally encompasses a full, whole life from birth to the current position of the writer, and that pertains to biography as well. So Nelson Mandela, for example, wrote his autobiography, which is also a memoir, but he's so well known, such a famous man, that he could include absolutely every detail of his life. And the more the better, because we want to know everything. A memoir generally focuses on a slice of life. And Danae also asked this, is it a slice of life? What exactly is a memoir? A memoir focuses on that slice of life, an issue in our lives. It focuses on a central incident or experience, on a writer's emotional truth. It must be true. So, for instance, a memoir could focus on, let's say, giving up an addiction to alcohol. But this could span a life of 20 years. Or a memoir could focus on one journey of a month, perhaps the time one trained and swam to Robben Island, just for as an example. A memoir is always personal, often intense, and it does not include every detail of your life, whereas an autobiography is chronological, historical, and factual. And then Nomvula also asked, how would she turn her reflections from her practice into personal essay? So I take it, Nomvula, you're possibly a psychologist or a doctor. What I always suggest is write your story, and this pertains to everybody, from your personal perspective, including your thoughts and opinions. The focus is on writing the personal. So get the bones down, then decide how to edit or rewrite. So there's no pattern. I can't say this is exactly what you should do. But what you do need to do is simply start working with the material. So perhaps you could look at your notes, at your own diaries, at the stories that you've gathered in your practice. Try and look at what you're attempting to accomplish. Do you want to focus on a particular theme that would run through each essay? Are you going to focus on each different patient? Perhaps that would be a chapter. What would you like your reader to come away with on completing the reading of the essays? And I think this is something we can ask ourselves in general in writing memoir, because it is not simply the record of anecdotes. Someone did ask about theme, which we're going to get to later, but there is generally some kind of overarching theme, some overarching story. It's like any other piece of writing. You want to keep the reader turning the pages. So you're going to look at all the devices at your disposal in order to help you create a book that people want to read. So there are all sorts of considerations around grouping chapters. How does one make a memoir hang together? First of all, though, get it out of your head. Many of us have our stories, but we're afraid to start writing for lots of different reasons, or we think, where do I start? How do I start? And for me, it really is just that first day, that commitment to my story, and begin wherever you feel you need to begin. And often, I think we need to rely on gut. We need to rely on what our body tells us. So we can often make a little list of important events in our lives, and then we simply choose one. We put ourselves in that scene, in that moment of time, and we start to write. And we are always surprised by what happens, what more we remember, and what that scene leads us to in our other writing. So yes, that would be how I'd start. And I think some of these other questions, Nomvula, are going to also speak to what you've asked. The next one I'm gonna tackle is a question by Heather Joyce. And I think this is a really good illustration itself of what we go through as writers. She's written a long question. I'm just going to have a sip of water quickly. And she writes, my questions and doubts are all around the line between autobiography and memoir. I started writing my past down primarily so that my daughters will have an account of what happened. As such, I wanted to be truthful. But as I'm writing, I keep seeing ways of making it more readable, more engaging, by editing things out and condensing or exaggerating others, for example. I have a partly finished version that keeps slipping from one style to the other, especially when I hit the wall of what really happened being too painful. I start thinking, well, I've survived, really. What's the point in dragging all this up again? Might as well make it entertaining. Then I feel like I'm cheating, but it feels like a better story. just not 100% true anymore. Help. I really would like to finish the work, but I don't know what it is anymore. Do I just change all the names and call it fiction, or stay true to the original plan? So I think any of us who have written anything will absolutely relate to this, because I think it is the writer's lot. The doubt that sets in, the idea that we start off with becoming something else the more we learn about ourselves or the experience that we're writing about. So for me, my answer to Heather, or my suggestion to Heather, is stick to the original plan. What a gift for your children. Autobiography is the inclusion of everything, as we've said, and usually everything factual. But it seems to me that you're heading more into the territory of memoir. You want to record the details of your life, but it's becoming more of a hybrid kind of a work, more of a memoir, more personal. And it sounds as if this is the way to go for you, because it's what's keeping you interested in the writing. And ultimately, this is what we want as authors, to stay interested in our own story. And we often speak about this at All About Writing, is that we don't want to write down one damn thing after the next. You know, a memoir is not what I had for breakfast, and then my snooze at mid-morning, then my lunch, and then a telephone call with my child in the afternoon, because that would be deathly dull for the reader. A memoir is about finding those events, finding those times of life that are not only interesting to the reader, but that are really interesting to you. So no wonder that you're starting to cut those sections out that you find less interesting, that you're using a little bit of exaggeration. And I think what is really important about a memoir is that you stick to your emotional truth. Writing a memoir allows us to bend the rules a little, because we are recreating from memory after all. And what memory is precise? None of us have precise memories, even if we have taken notes. We've even filtered out sections of our memory, sections of the experience in our actual journal notes that we can refer to. What I will say, though, is a memoir, as I've said, needs to be an emotional truth. And also, we can't lie. I'm going to refer now to a memoir by Misha Defonesca. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she is an author of a fake memoir written 20 years ago, about how she was raised by wolves during the Second World War. And it turned out that it was a complete fabrication. So it really was fiction. And she was ultimately ordered to pay back to her publisher the 22 million rand that she had earned off it, because it became a bestseller. You know, she also claimed to have shot a Nazi soldier. This we cannot do. So we cannot make up a life that we didn't live. As far as being entertaining, that's probably one of the requirements of a memoir, which might sound strange, but people want to read it because it's a page turner. People want to read because they are resonating with the story. There's generally a deep desire that we have as writers to tell a particular story, a passion to tell a story. That's what keeps us going. And that also is what keeps the reader interested. So that's where the entertainment value lies. I'm not saying you've got to do somersaults and tell jokes in the writing, not at all. But what I am saying is it does need to entertain you while you write, and then you will have a sense that it's going to entertain your reader as well. Just something I've included here is the poet Philippa Jaar de Villiers. I heard her say this at a seminar the other day. She said, "I don't know what I think until I've written it." And she wrote, "The police in the brain is constantly there. Allow the doubt to write itself out." So I think this pertains to your question as well, Heather. Allow those doubts. Allow that sense of, oh, this is turning into something different to what I imagined it was going to be. And that's because your subconscious is taking you to other areas. Allow your subconscious mind also to do the work. When we're sleeping at night, our brains work, our brains come up with ideas, with sentences, our brains remember things that perhaps we haven't consciously remembered. So allow all of that to be part of your experimentation, part of your oeuvre, as it were, of the information that you're gathering for your memoir. Okay, Carol Wall-G, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says, I'm struggling to decide whether I should be writing a first or third person narrative, which is recommended for a memoir about a very large family. Okay, in memoir, you are the main character. And this sounds strange to think of oneself as a character, but we do become the character as we write. Fiction writers invent entire worlds and determine how much of that world is revealed to the narrator. But memoir is essentially a first-person narrative, and it reflects the author's truth all of the time. A memoir is, in essence, a collection of memories written by the person, him or herself. You are telling your story from your perspective, seeing the world from your point of view. Although, as I say this, there are, for instance, memoir-type novels that have been written. I'm thinking of J.M. Coetzee's Boyhood, for example, and some of his other work, which could be described as a memoir-type read. But he, as the narrator, is removed from the telling of the story. It's more objective. However, he is using his life as material. He is using his life and exploring his life and reflecting on his life. The advantage of using a first person is the sense of immediacy it brings, that the reader is right in the writer's skin, has first-hand access to their passions and opinions and motivations, their thoughts. If you're writing about a large family, you will still see each member of that family through your own eyes, whether third person or first person. It all has to be based on your memories. So you'd still be seeing the action from your own experience, in a sense. Third person takes the writing into the region, I would say, of creative nonfiction. So instead of starting the sentences with I, you'd be using she or he. She, and interestingly enough, the memoir I have just written, I wrote a section from the she perspective, because I just thought I want to remove myself from this experience, and writing as she allowed me almost to just be a little bit more objective, to remove myself from the action and to see it in a different way. I have, however, since rewritten that section, going back to the first perspective, the first person perspective, I, because it feels more honest in a sense. So I don't know if that helps you, but I would probably recommend write it from the I perspective. Write what you see about your family, what you know about each member of that family through your eyes. Mali Bongwe writes, how does one write about other people and their actions, which I think also pertains to your question about family. Pietru has tied in with this, saying, how do you write about other people, friends, enemies, family, how to deal with sensitivity, change names? Does one ask permission, especially from friends and family? Vida also wants to know, is it good practice to get people's permission for mentioning them in the memoir, even if you just use their first names? I would say always write, frankly and with honesty. Write the story and how it affected you. And let's face it, most of us, you know, don't have the happiest families, or don't have the happy childhood that we always expected that we would have or would like to have had. A lot of us look back to our family lives, to our childhoods, and we discover that there were issues, there were problems, even in the social context that we lived in, there were disappointments, there was difficult politics. So I would always say, get your story down first. Put in the other characters, whether it's family or friends or enemy, write what you need to about those characters. Give yourself permission to write whatever it is you need to. You can decide how to alter it later. But I see too many people actually censoring themselves too early on, saying, "Ooh, I can't write about, great Aunt Maud, who was in the loony bin because great Aunt Sally will be upset and will never speak to me again." And so we don't write the story. So really just trust your instinct. If the story is important enough to you, write it down. Often we think to ourselves, what will people say? What will so-and-so, or will so-and-so recognize themselves? Will so-and-so be offended? And often we have this fear before we've even written anything. So I would say just screw in those little doubts into a jar, place it on a shelf somewhere, and just get on with writing the story. Bear in mind, though, ultimately, if you use actual names, you can bring on the wrath of a family member or a public figure. If you're writing about a public figure, I would possibly get some legal advice on how to handle it, particularly if you are going to expose secrets or things that aren't in the public domain. Yeah, on the other hand, if you're writing about family, if you're writing about your own experience, I love this quote from Bird by Anne Lamott, who writes, "You own everything that happened to you. Tell your stories. If people wanted you to write warmly about them, they should have behaved better." And I love that quote when I read it because it gave me permission to write what I needed to write, what my emotional truth was. And I think I need to say this about families as well, is that whatever structure of families are constituted, in whatever structure they're constituted, every sibling in that family, the parents are going to experience that family in a different way. So, one is going to have a sister or a brother who experienced their childhood as incredibly happy, while there's going to be another sibling who was perhaps beaten by the father. So I know that sounds very extreme, but in fact, often that is the case in families, that children have extreme experiences. And also it depends on your actual order of birth. Middle children, they say, are generally the ones who are kind of dragged up. The older child is encouraged, pushed, pressurized. The youngest child is adulated, adored, particularly if it's a son, it seems, he's the baby. So middle children often say, "Oh, well, I was left out of the loop." So, that also depends, or your story is also going to expose that order of the childhood and the relationship that you have with your own siblings. Yeah, so as regards permission, some writers like to get permission. I think it's really up to you. I do think to myself, what if we ask permission? If we go to someone and say, "I'm writing the story, I'd like your permission." If that person says no, then what? Are we going to continue writing the story, or are we going to abandon that story, our own personal truth, because somebody else might be upset? So I would really say, write your story. Then you can consider how important it is that you bring your story into the public domain. I do know a writer who wrote about her mother's vulnerabilities, and she decided that she would only publish after her mother's death. Fair enough. Yeah, as far as changing names are concerned, I changed names in my first memoir, or rather gave people nicknames. In the next memoir, I'm doing the same, but there are also characters whom I refer to by name. And yeah, I just always go back to that lovely idea of it is my story. Again, one doesn't want to hurt people. There are things that are called revenge memoirs, where misery memoirs, where every single detail of abuse is mentioned, where people write in order to actually hurt someone, perhaps who's possibly hurt them. So there's no judgment about it. I'm not judging any memoirs, but I will say just be aware of the kind of memoir that you are writing. And of course, we want to be sensitive, but we also don't want to abandon our own story. So keep on writing. Yeah, and just another example I have here is Augustine Burroughs, who was sued by his family, who won, and this was back in 2007, some $2 million because he had written absolutely with candor about the lives of every person in his family and not in glowing terms. I've absolutely loved his writing because of the dire honesty of it. And that really resonated and spoke to me. But yeah, you've got to have a lot of guts to be prepared to do that. But actually, let's do it. Let's tell our stories. That's what I say. Okay, another question. I think this is also from Malibongwe. How do you write time in a memoir? When do you begin? How do you sequence the events and deal with chronology? Okay, there needs to be a certain logical structure, but this depends on your story and how you plan to tell it. You can tell it chronologically, or you can tell it looking back in flashback form. You can tell it chronologically and include flashbacks, remembered scenes of the past. You can incorporate backstory, which is background snippets that are pertinent to the unfolding story that may inform and qualify that unfolding story. Then there are devices that you can use, headings or adding years in particular sentences, or merely saying yesterday or the next day, or when I saw him later. So there are a lot of ways that you can leave clues in the text to denote time. Another point to remember is that the structure of your memoir does not have to be chronological, as I've said. As they say, a story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end, but it does not necessarily have to appear in that order. You can decide how your story will play out. Now, this is where plotting and pantsing comes into the story, because plotters will decide, well, I am going to start my memoir from the moment I became a foster child. That is the point that I'm going to start writing from, and I'm going to write up until my adult life. And they will plot out every single chapter, what happened when, where they lived, what homes they lived in. Other people have a sense that they'd like to write about their adoption and their foster life, but they don't know where to start. And this is where pantsing comes in, writing by the seat of your pants, that you would simply start writing somewhere, choose a seminal event, an important event, and start writing about it and see where that takes you. So for me, that is more or less the way I write. But the more I write, the more I have a sense of the shape of the memoir, the more I have a sense of where it's going, what I want to start with, what might possibly be the opening scene. So I always say, just get it down. So I hope that answers question about time in the greater scheme of things, the structure, and then also just how we denote days and actual hours in a memoir. I often refer to, waking up at 3 a.m. in the morning. And this for me is also a device, because I'm usually my most depressed at 3 a.m. in the morning. And I'm sure a lot of people recognize that as well, kind of waking up in those twilight hours. So, so time can become important. It can become a symbol in a memoir. Okay, another question is, how do you write dialogue and voices in an authentic and credible way when you can't be sure of what people said exactly? Okay, none of us can remember exactly what people said. I mean, unless we are following people around with, a tape recorder or our telephones, cell phones, recording what they say. I sometimes follow my son around with a notebook because he says the most priceless things. And I just want to capture that moment. But really, it's unrealistic to be doing that. So again, this comes into emotional truth. We remember particular conversations. We remember how the words made us feel. We remember the tone. We remember the essence of the conversation, the content of the conversation. And this is what you can aim for. So if you want to bring in dialogue, which I always think is a good thing, because it brings the reader of your memoir right into the immediacy of the story. You write in the head of the person who is speaking. So try and start writing dialogue with the idea of remembering the essence and the tone and the content. And then you can begin to hone those conversations as well. If you know your characters, and this is the wonderful thing about memoir, is that we are dealing with people who exist or existed in the past, whereas the fiction writer has to make up everything about these characters. We already know these characters and we know ourselves, and we're getting to know ourselves even better. So we know if our characters are, let's say, extrovert and garrulous. We know the kind of conversation that they'd engage in. They might want to shock people with a snippet of conversation or some gossip that they've overheard. Or on the other hand, you might be including the conversation of a character who's reticent and shy, and their conversation would reflect this. They would be a bit more hesitant. They might use a tell, they might use the word, or whatever it is. And this can be also extended to their physical characteristics. What do your characters look like? What your character's traits and their facial looks, how does that reflect who they are as a character? But just to get back to the dialogue, if you consider them as a character, you're more likely to give them authentic speech. So what I'm saying is to consider who they are as a character. Are they the forward person, or are they the person who hangs back? Trust your gut. Remember what you can and embroider a little in order to tell your story. And I'm never going to advocate lying, but embroidering a story is fine. And really, I think it's considered common practice in memoir, simply because of the fact that we're relying on our memories. We're relying on those little snippets, those perhaps one-liners that we remember, the mood of the day, the event that happened. So just trust yourself, trust your gut, and start writing the dialogue. Note as well, the dialogue between people can often be quite tedious. I mean, if we had to record every single aspect of a conversation, there'd be a lot of repetition, there'd be the small talk, we'd be talking about the weather for a little bit, or how are you? No, I'm fine. When we're writing a memoir, when we're writing any book, you want to hone that conversation so that the pertinent bits are there, the mood and the tone exist. But we are going to cut the small talk. Unless, of course, it's important to show that your character could never deal with the truth. Whenever you said to, let's say, your mother, I was abused by uncle so-and-so, and your mother says, no, we're not going to talk about that now. Look, the sun is out. Then you would obviously include that as conversation. So you can see, even by that example, how a small snippet of conversation can show the polarity of two people who might feature in a memoir. Okay, so you want to prune the dialogue, write the dialogue, and it can be pruned down to the essentials in content and in style. All right, how do you choose? This is the next question. How do you choose what experiences to include and which to skip or leave out? And I think, it's the same answer. It is that life is one damn thing after another. There's no way we can include everything. Every conversation about our lives, about our children. Of course, we're going to choose the parts of our memoir, the events of our lives that are pertinent to the story. So if I think of that early example I used, if one is writing about one's alcoholism, you're going to include the time you got drunk at the Christmas party or at the birthday party. You're going to include the time you decided to go to therapy. You're going to include perhaps booking into a clinic. You're not going to include, unless it's highly pertinent, a protracted scene on your birth, which really had very little to do with your alcohol addiction. So I would always suggest is start jotting down those seminal scenes. Start just making lists to loosen up the memory. What are the scenes of my life? What are the scenes of my memoir that I want to tell? It also gives us a place to start. If we can go to a list like that and we can say, yeah, you know what, today I'm in the mood for exploring that scene. I'm strong enough to write about that Christmas party where I let it all hang out. So you begin by collecting material. And this is what I do, and I think it's actually a great way to attempt a memoir, is just to make the list of the scenes and start writing those little scenes and also reflections, because memoir can be livened up by scenes, but memoir is also reflecting on what happened. You know, taking oneself, the writer, I take myself into a more objective mode, and I try and think about what I've learned, what I've experienced, what I've gained. So that's how, you know, again, you've got to create a lot of material that you can look at before you can decide, yes, I'm going to put this in, I'm going to leave this out. So not everything you write will make it into the memoir, and you might need to write additional material at some stage. All right, Dimitri Martinez writes, how do I write about my younger self? Do I trust my memory? I'm 61 years old and my recollections of my youth are unreliable, not to mention littered with fragments of traumatic memories. So again, you know, we have to allow ourselves permission. So you have to, as a writer, put yourself in the shoes of your younger self, go back in time and begin to remember. And what I will assure you is the more you remember, the more you will remember. The more you loosen up the mind, the more those memories will come. There's a wonderful series of memoirs by Dennis Herson. I haven't got their names at the tip of my tongue, but each memoir is a collection of single sentences. Some are longer than others, but every single sentence starts with, I remember. I remember the time my parents took me to Bioscope and I fell asleep in the back of the car. I remember the movie that was on. I remember having popcorn, etc., etc. So I would call it quite an experimental memoir, but I just love that idea of just starting every sentence with I remember. And when we allow ourselves to remember the good and the more traumatic, we will remember more. Another trick
Um,
in remembering
uh,
our, hi, Josie. Yes, we're
yeah,
coming to Emma now, but
yeah.
the trick is to slow down. You know, really, you know, we as writers, you know, and certainly this is what happens to me is I want to get it down on the page. I want it all to be on the page right now, or I'll chastise myself. Why can't I remember? That was such an important day. Why can't I remember? And then what I do is I take a breath, I settle into my body, and I start with something small, and that invariably leads to something else. And I really think it is about just allowing the memory. So use your senses. Once you get going, you'll be surprised at what you do remember. And I'm talking now about childhood memories, even memories from last week. Some of us haven't got the best memories, but yes, it is all recorded there. And the more you write, the more you will release. You can start to activate your memory and things will come back. The traumatic memories are sadly part of your past, part of my past, part of the pasts of many of us. And how we overcame trauma is often the subject matter of a memoir. People want to actually read trauma. It's not that they want to be the voyeur, but so many of us resonate with death, dying, trauma, whatever it is. And when we read about other people's experiences, it really helps us to deal with our own experience. So don't be afraid of trauma. And what I'm going to ask is Emma, who's with All About Writing as well. She's a trauma expert. So I thought
Yeah, well,
she could say a
yeah.
few
Should I
words.
say Emma's a drama therapist with a particular interest in trauma. So we thought it would be interesting for her just to give you a little insight from a neuroscience perspective. Thanks, Em.
Hi, so I don't know if I'm an expert in trauma, but I have done a lot of work in that area. I'm a drama therapist, so from the neuroscience perspective, my understanding just comes from that. And what I've looked into is working with clients. So um, what they say around memory and trauma, there's quite a lot of like controversy there in terms of repressed memories, those kind of things. So I'm not going to be getting into that. What we know, as Joanne has said, is memory does tend to be just in general fairly unreliable. We have a saying that if you're remembering something, you're actually remembering the last time you remembered it. So every time you take out a memory and examine it, it can distort a little bit, it changes details. And then in terms of childhood memory and traumatic memory, they tend to be created and stored and processed a bit differently. So obviously as a child, because your brain is not fully formed yet, particularly the sort of prefrontal parts of your brain and verbal processing parts, there's going to be more of a sort of attachment to sensory and emotional memories, which is also often what happens with traumatic memories. So you'll find with trauma, one of two things can happen is that it can very much be burned into your brain because that keeps replaying over and over again because your brain latches onto it as something significant. Also, you may have to talk about it quite often, it will replay. That doesn't mean that it is completely correct because in the replaying it can distort, or you can find that it's very fragmented. You don't really have a lot of details, and this is because your brain tends to go into sort of survival mode, and it goes into the what we call the lizard brain sometimes, which is those survival parts. And the sort of prefrontal and verbal centers will sort of shut down a bit. So the memory is going to be processed more through sensory and emotional things. So you may have very strong emotional feelings and attachments. So there is that emotional truth that comes up. And sensory memory. So if you are wanting to kind of find ways to jog some of those memories, then through sensory input can be a good way to do that. When I work with clients, I work a lot with story that kind of gets at the feelings and emotions, even if they don't have the full memory. I work with sensory input and I work with the body and that kind of thing. So yeah, just basically in terms of how those memories are stored and processed, that's sort of the understanding we have, although it's obviously like very complex. So that's just a very basic overview from my understanding of it.
Okay, thanks so much, Emma.
Thank you, Em.
That is really interesting. I think just from a writerly perspective, I'm interested in what you also say about memory, that it's can be unreliable. And you're also getting back to that whole idea of the emotional truth. So, you know, a memoirist is not expected to be accountable for every single word of their memoir. It doesn't all have to be completely accurate, but the emotional truth is accurate. And that's what you can access
Yes.
in your brain. Yeah, great. Thanks, Emma. You know, just on this as well, if you want to access memories, go to photographs, go to letters, Go to those kind of tangible things that you can read and look at, which might also jog memories. And I would say, don't be afraid of trauma. It's part of our history as South Africans. I think we've all experienced trauma in some sort of way, guilt, violence. So, we can't get away from having lived in a land with a traumatic past. And I know there are people here that are from other countries. So whatever your trauma is, or whatever your difficulties or challenges in life, it ultimately will make your memoir a strong piece of writing, because those are the things that we feel very passionately about. And often that's what we want to write about. Also, let's face it, no one really wants to read a memoir about someone who, has the best life. They grow up, get a cum laude degree, a fantastic job, they meet Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, they live happily ever after and die in their sleep. I mean, no, because life isn't like that. We want to read about difficulty and how people overcome difficulty. And I'm not saying all memoirs are inclined to difficulty, but I mean, even something as simple as, let's say, an expedition to Tibet, climbing Mount Everest. It is a challenge. People want to know, what were the difficulties? What were the dead bodies that you saw? Did you make it to the top? Or did you only go halfway and decide that you would come back? And that in itself was a decision you made to protect your life. So, okay, all right, we're going to move on to I'm just looking at time running away from us. Karen Pozimski writes, how necessary is an overarching thread to a memoir? I'm having trouble finding one in my writing. The one uniting factor is my voice as the narrator. I'm hoping for a thread that might emerge as I continue writing. I've written about 35,000 words so far. How essential do you think this is? Okay, I think an overarching thread is very important. I would say it's essential. It means that your memoir has greater meaning than simply the events on the page. So if I refer to my memoir again, I was writing the events of death and dying, but the theme was loss and recovery. And it was always with those themes in mind that I wrote. So I was writing about loss, moving towards recovery, an overarching theme, but the events were about death and dying. So, yeah. And again, I've spoken about how I handled loss as a child, which also started to come into the memoir, but only once I'd started writing it. Another thing that you've mentioned, Karen, is voice. We all have a certain voice. And I'm talking about the physical voice, the sound that comes out, but also the way we choose words, the way we tell a story, the style of our writing, what we choose to put in and what we choose to leave out. Our stories, our lives are unique. We are completely unique individuals. So that comes into the voice, comes into how the story comes across on the page. And that is something really important that we want to capture. What is your voice? How are you going to tell the story? And once one finds one's voice, that's a great moment. And I think it takes time to find a voice. You just have to keep on writing. And voice, also, you've got to trust your gut too. And I like the way you brought up the body, Emma, because I think, we have to listen to our voice. When I say listen to our voice, read it on the page, also read it aloud. Get a sense of the rhythm of our voice, the kind of things that interest us, the kind of content that we're interested in, and that will all show in your voice. So yes, theme is important, voice is important, but again, sometimes we don't know these things when we begin writing. They only make themselves clear once we've written further down the line. Vida Lee Seek.
Joe, I think we'll watch, but I think we might have time for only one more, depending
one more. Okay,
how
all
long
right.
you speak, and because then we want to tell you a few things at the end. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. All right. I'm going to answer these because they're short. I'll keep the answers short. Pietru asks, does creative nonfiction fit into the memoir genre? Memoir is really creative nonfiction. You have your voice, your way of telling your story, you have the elements of style, the craft that comes with the actual literary value. Again, we've dealt with, okay, so she says memory is nebulous, including a fictional situation to explain an actual event. Can you do this? I would say no, you can't include a fictional event. You can exaggerate a little, embroider a little, but I think it's all got to be based on some kind of truth. The role of metaphor in writing, yes, of course. An example would be water is often used to symbolize fluidity or cleansing. Experimental memoir, yes. Aughts and fragments, it doesn't have to be a continuous fluid story. You can write in paragraphs and short chapters, going backwards and forwards. Does your story have to have a moral? I would say a memoir must avoid the moral lesson. However, it will come through in your writing without having to beat the reader over the head with it. So the refusal to provide a clear moral theme makes the story richer, even though the theme will show itself. You're just not going to start your memoir by saying, this is a memoir of, and by the time you've read this, you will understand X, Y, and Z. Okay, so my clock says we've got 5 more minutes. Okay, so can I do
I have 4 minutes. So let's.
You have 4 minutes. Okay. There was one question I'd like to answer. Can I quickly do it?
Answer it. Yeah.
Okay. It was someone, Vida Lee Seek, wanted to ask about the time period to observe before you write about the South African National Defence Force. Now, I just think this is an important question which pertains to many of us, is it's high time that we told the stories of our lives. And I was thinking of that when I thought about the truth and reconciliation sessions people were invited to, where they told their truth. Sometimes people don't want to know the truth, but I think it's important. And I think we need to face whatever truth there is that needs to be told in our lives. So if you've had a wartime experience, or if you've had an experience of apartheid that has left you scarred, I think it's really important to claim those stories and to write them. And yes, Josie, I suppose I could go on. We have some more questions, but yeah, okay, yes. All right.
We will, as we said, we'll try and include the remaining questions and answers in the thank you mail. I, by the way, have watched the chat box, and there were 3 questions, but they've all actually been answered by, your other answers. So I would like, firstly, just to remind you that we are hosting an editing workshop run by Helen Moffat on the 25th of May. And there is still room in that. Please sign up for it. She'll be talking about how a writer can edit their work, how this differs from rewriting and polishing. It will be via Zoom, South African time, 10 till 12:30, 10 a.m. till 12:30. So that's the 25th of May. And then, excitingly, and Leslie, I'd love it if you joined us, we are going back, Joe and I will be doing what has now become our annual workshop and retreat in Barrydale, in the heart of the Karoo, over the weekend, 26th to the 28th. We will be running a workshop which includes the skills of memoir writing. Then the week that follows, it will be a retreat during which you will have one-on-one time with us. If you want to join the retreat, you don't have to be a memoirist. You can be writing anything, in fact. And we just wanted to tell you a little bit about the lovely town of village of Barrydale, and how those who want go down in the early morning before breakfast and dip our bodies in the freezing river in the pass, clambering over rocks and swimming in the rock pool. Leslie, you have done that, as have you, Joe. So feel free to jump in and say, and there's lots of fabulous Karoo food,
Yes.
lamb and yes.
Yeah.
So
can I jump in here, Josie?
jump in, and Leslie
I'll
then jump in too.
Yeah. So that is a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful experience. I'm getting more and more fond of my 10 days in Barrydale. I find it such a tonic. And often I think people think, oh, I can't do it. It's too expensive. How will it help my writing? But I think, and this goes for any writing retreat, any course we take, anything to improve our writing skills. It's a gift to ourselves. Because ultimately we're taking our writing seriously, and we're calling on people who've trod the path and asking them for their guidance. So that's what Josie and I provide.
Yes.
I know Barrydale might not be for everybody, but yeah, please come and share with us. It's a lovely experience.
We'd love you to join us. We still have some space. Leslie, just maybe give us a word or two, just because I noticed you and you were there 2 years running. So tell us what it was like for you.
Oh, I've been to every one, and I love, 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 love it. And I often want to just go to Berrydale even on my own because it's just so fun, so nice. It's busy. It's very busy. So if you bring a partner, they might feel a little bit ignored, but it's really, I'm sad. I'm going to still be in America, so I'm not going to go. I kind of tempted to skip the two weddings I'm invited to just to come to burial, but I'm not going to. So yeah, but I recommend it. It's you don't even think about the money. It's such good food, such good input. You get so much done, although I'm still working on the same book, but it's amazing. I recommend
That's
it.
okay. And even the icy cold swims in the Trudeau Pass.
I loved it. Loved the swims. They're so like it's like a bucket list. Something I think everybody has to do. It's just amazing.
Fabulous. Thanks, Leslie.
Leslie, I'm glad you mentioned that you're still working on your memoir, because it's been several years. And I think this ultimately, when one's writing a memoir, it is a commitment. It is a commitment to ourselves to write that story that's burning inside, or perhaps that is gently kind of floating around, but we want to bring it to the world. We want to bring it to ourselves or our families. So yeah, please honor yourselves in whichever way you tell your story and however long it takes. It is a process, remember.
Watch out for your thank you email. It will include the link to the recording, and we will give information about those upcoming events.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you all for joining us this evening. As usual, it was a delight. It's lovely to see you all and hear your questions and your enthusiasm. It's quite addictive. Thank you. Okay, see
Cheers,
you next
everybody.
time.
Thank you so much.